The huge space station called New Olympia floated in the darkness between stars like a bright metal city. Inside its giant walls, thousands of beings from different worlds had come to watch the most important sports event in the galaxy. The Galactic Athletic Championships happened only once every 4 years, and this time it was bigger than ever before. The main arena was so large that small ships could fly inside it. Bright lights hung from the ceiling like artificial suns, making everything glow with white and blue light. The air buzzed with excitement and the sound of many different languages being spoken at once. Some voices were high and musical, others deep and rumbling, and a few made clicking sounds that hurt human ears. In the expensive seats near the front, alien dignitaries sat in their finest robes and ceremonial armor. The Krethari wore their traditional silver masks that covered their entire faces. The tall, thin Etherians floated slightly above their seats, their blue skin shimmering like water. Fat, round Bolgans rolled back and forth in their special chairs, making happy grunting sounds when their favorite athletes appeared on the field below. Up in the military section, far from the fancy seats, Jake Morrison sat alone on a hard metal bench. He looked out of place among all the celebration and joy. His gray hair was cut short in military style, and deep lines marked his weathered face. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and his left arm was completely artificial. The cybernetic limb was painted black metal, and small, blue lights blinked along the joints where it connected to his shoulder. Jake wore his old military jacket, even though it was too warm in the arena. The jacket had patches from different battles and units he had served with during the Proxima Wars. Most people who saw him looked away quickly. War veterans made civilians uncomfortable, especially ones who showed their injuries so openly. He had not wanted to come to the tournament at all. His daughter Lisa had begged him for weeks to attend. She worked as a medical officer on New Olympia and thought it would be good for him to get out and see something positive for once. Jake preferred to stay in his small apartment and work on fixing old machines. People were too complicated, and most of them did not understand what soldiers had gone through in the war. Down on the field, young athletes from 12 different species were warming up for the competition. Each group stayed with their own kind, practicing the events that showed off their natural abilities. The Krethari team moved like liquid metal, their bodies bending in ways that seemed impossible. The Etherian flyers danced through the air without wings, using some kind of mental power to lift themselves. But it was the Zalarian team that caught Jake's attention. The insect-like aliens had 4 arms and 2 large wings that sparkled like stained glass in the arena lights. They were known throughout the galaxy for being the fastest and most agile flyers. Most of them moved through their practice routines with perfect grace, spinning and diving through obstacle courses set up in the air. Most of them, but not all. One young Zalarian struggled to keep up with his teammates. His left wing was smaller than his right one, and it moved strangely, like it was broken or badly healed. When he tried to fly the same patterns as the others, he wobbled and lost control. Twice he crashed into the soft barriers around the practice area, landing hard on the padded floor. The other Zalarians did not help him up. Instead, they moved their practice to the other side of the field as if they were embarrassed by him. Coaches from different species watched the struggling athlete and shook their heads. Some made notes on their electronic tablets, probably, marking him as someone not worth watching. Jake found himself studying the young alien more carefully. The boy, and he was clearly young even by alien standards, did not give up. Every time he fell, he got back up and tried again. His movements were awkward, and his crashes were painful to watch, but something burned in his large compound eyes that Jake recognized. It was the same look he had seen in wounded soldiers who refused to quit, even when their bodies were broken. The veteran's military training kicked in automatically. He began analyzing the boy's problem like he would study an enemy position. The damaged wing was obvious, but there were other issues too. The young Zalarian was trying to fly exactly like his healthy teammates, which would never work with his injury. He needed to find a different way, but nobody was teaching him how. Around Jake, other spectators pointed and whispered about the struggling athlete. He heard bits of conversation in languages he understood. Most people seemed to think it was cruel to let someone so disabled compete. Others wondered why the Zalarian team had brought him at all. A few made jokes about it, laughing at each crash and failed attempt. The boy's name, Jake learned from the announcements, was HFY. He was 16 years old in human terms and had been selected for the team despite his wing damage. The announcers mentioned this briefly, then moved on to talk about the other more promising athletes. It was clear that nobody expected HFY to do well in any of the events. As the warm-up period continued, Jake watched HFY fall behind more and more. The other Zalarians had moved to advanced flight patterns, practicing complex maneuvers that would be used in the actual competition. HFY was still struggling with basic movements, trying over and over to master turns that came naturally to healthy flyers. The arena grew louder as more spectators arrived for the opening ceremonies. Bands played music from different worlds, creating a strange but exciting mix of sounds. Vendors walked through the stands selling food and souvenirs. Children of many species ran around wearing the colors of their favorite teams. But Jake's attention stayed focused on the lonely figure practicing by himself in the corner of the field. Something about HFY reminded him of soldiers he had known, good soldiers who had been written off because of their wounds. He thought about Martinez, who had lost both legs but became the best scout in the unit because he learned to move silently on his prosthetics. He remembered Singh, whose damaged eye actually made her a better sniper because she had learned to see differently. The preliminary events were about to begin. Soon, HFY would have to compete in front of thousands of spectators. Jake could see the fear starting to mix with determination in the young alien's posture. The boy was brave, but bravery alone would not be enough. He needed help, and it was clear that nobody else was going to give it to him. Jake Morrison had spent 30 years in the military. He had fought in battles across 3 star systems and led men and women through impossible situations. He had learned that sometimes the most important victories came not from defeating enemies, but from helping fellow soldiers become more than they thought they could be. The opening ceremony began with a parade of athletes. Each species marched around the arena while their anthem played and their flag was displayed on the giant screens. The crowd cheered loudest for their own people, but there was polite applause for everyone. When the Zalarian team flew their victory lap around the arena, HFY struggled to keep up with the formation. He fell behind several times, and by the end, he was flying alone while his teammates finished together. Jake made his decision. He stood up from his seat, ignoring the surprised looks from other military personnel around him. His daughter, Lisa, was working in the medical station, but she would understand later. Right now, there was a young warrior who needed help, and Jake Morrison had never been able to walk away from that kind of situation. The veteran began making his way down through the stands toward the competitor area. His military bearing and determined expression made people step aside without being asked. Behind him, the crowd continued to cheer and celebrate, unaware that something important was about to happen on the field below. The preliminary events started right after the opening ceremony ended. Athletes from all 12 species took their positions around the massive arena floor. Each group had their own section with equipment designed for their particular abilities. The air filled with nervous energy as competitors prepared to show what they could do. Jake Morrison walked down the steps between the seats, moving with the steady pace of someone who had made up his mind. Other spectators glanced at him as he passed, wondering why a military veteran was leaving his assigned section. His artificial arm caught the arena lights as he moved, the metal gleaming against his dark jacket. On the field below, the first event was beginning. The Etherian team floated through a complex maze suspended in the air, using their mental powers to move glowing orbs from one end to the other. Their blue skin grew brighter as they concentrated, and the crowd watched in amazed silence as they completed the course in perfect formation. Next came the Krathari strength trials. The silver-masked aliens lifted massive weights that would crush most other species. Their muscles bulged under their metallic skin as they moved objects that weighed as much as small vehicles. The audience cheered and stamped their feet, making the entire arena shake with the sound. But it was the Zalarian aerial trials that everyone was really waiting for. The insect-like aliens were famous throughout the galaxy for their flying skills. Their events were always the most exciting to watch, full of speed and grace that took your breath away. The Zalarian team took their positions at one end of the arena. A complex obstacle course had been set up in the air above the field. Glowing rings hung at different heights, connected by beams of light that the flyers had to navigate around. Floating platforms moved in slow patterns, creating a constantly changing maze. The goal was to fly through the entire course as quickly as possible without touching any of the obstacles. HFY stood with his teammates, but slightly apart from them. His damaged wing twitched nervously as he watched the other Zalarians prepare. They stretched their wings wide and tested their flight muscles, looking confident and ready. When they looked at HFY, their expressions were not encouraging. Tabomo, first Zalarian, launched into the air with perfect form. His wings caught the arena lights like stained glass windows as he flew through the course with incredible speed. He twisted around obstacles, dove under moving platforms, and shot through the glowing rings without slowing down. The crowd roared its approval as he finished with a time that set a new preliminary record. The second and third flyers did almost as well. Each one completed the course with the flowing grace that made their species famous. The Zalarian coaches nodded with satisfaction, making notes on their tablets about technique and timing. Then it was HFY's turn. The young alien stepped forward to the starting line, his damaged wing held awkwardly against his side. The arena grew quieter as spectators noticed his obvious disability. Some people leaned forward in their seats, curious to see what would happen. Others looked away, already feeling sorry for what they expected to see. HFY launched himself into the air with determination, but his problems became obvious immediately. His uneven wings made him fly in a crooked line instead of straight forward. When he tried to turn around the first obstacle, he overcompensated and nearly crashed into the arena wall. The crowd made worried sounds as he struggled to regain control during he too managed to get through the first few rings, but his timing was all wrong. Where the other flyers had moved with smooth confidence, HFY jerked and wobbled through the air. His damaged wing could not keep up with the demands of the course, and he fell further behind with each obstacle. Halfway through the course, disaster struck. HFY attempted a sharp turn around a moving platform, but his wing gave out completely. He tumbled through the air and crashed hard into one of the safety nets stretched below the course. The net caught him, but the impact looked painful. The arena fell completely silent. Slowly, HFY untangled himself from the net and dropped to the arena floor. His wing was bent at an unnatural angle, and bright blue blood trickled from cuts on his arms where the net had scraped him. But instead of staying down, he got back up and looked toward the starting line again. The Zalarian coaches rushed onto the field, speaking rapidly in their clicking language. They examined HFY's injuries and shook their heads. One of them gestured toward the medical station, clearly suggesting that the boy should withdraw from the competition, but HFY clicked back at them firmly, his compound eyes blazing with stubborn determination. The argument continued for several minutes, while the crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. Other competitors stopped their own warm-ups to see what was happening. Some looked sympathetic, but most seemed embarrassed by the whole situation. Finally, the coaches threw up their forearms in frustration and walked away, leaving HFY standing alone on the field. Jake Morrison had reached the barrier that separated the spectator area from the competition field. Two security guards, in bright yellow uniforms, blocked his path, politely but firmly explaining that only authorized personnel could enter the athlete area. Jake showed them his military identification, but they shook their heads. Veteran status did not give him access to the competition zone. Behind the guards, Jake could see HFY preparing to attempt the course again. The young alien's wing was clearly injured, but he was not giving up. Jake recognized that kind of stubborn courage. He had seen it in soldiers who kept fighting even when they were badly wounded, who refused to quit even when everyone else thought they should. The veteran looked at the security guards with the same expression he had used on enemy positions during the war. His voice was quiet but carried the authority of someone who had led troops into battle. "That boy down there is a warrior," Jake said in his rough accent. "He needs help, and I know how to give it to him. You can either let me through this barrier, or you can explain to your supervisors why you stopped a military veteran from assisting a fellow fighter." The guards looked at each other uncertainly. Jake's tone was not threatening, but something in his manner made them step aside. One of them spoke into his radio, probably asking for permission, but Jake was already walking past them toward the field. Lisa Morrison had been watching the Zalarian trials from the medical station when she spotted her father walking onto the competition area. She dropped the supplies she was organizing and hurried after him, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she ran. She knew that look on his face, the same expression he wore whenever he decided to do something that others would call impossible or crazy. "Dad, what are you doing?" she called out, but Jake was already approaching Krixva. The young Zalarian looked up in surprise and fear as the scarred human veteran walked toward him. Krixva had never seen someone like Jake up close. The artificial arm, the battle scars, and the intense expression made the human look dangerous. Other species often found humans intimidating, and Krixva took a step backward. But Jake stopped a respectful distance away and did something unexpected. Instead of speaking, he slowly removed his military jacket and set it carefully on the ground. Then he began rolling up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing not just his cybernetic arm but a network of scars and metal implants that covered his shoulder and upper chest. The arena grew quiet as spectators realized what was happening. Cameras zoomed in on the strange scene of the human veteran and the injured alien athlete. Announcers in the broadcast booths struggled to explain what they were seeing, because nothing like this had ever happened at a galactic sporting event before. Jake Morrison looked directly into Krixva's compound eyes and spoke in careful, accented galactic standard. His voice was rough but gentle, like a teacher talking to a student who was trying hard but needed guidance. "I know what it feels like," Jake said simply. "When your body won't do what it used to do. When everyone looks at you and sees only what's broken." He moved his artificial arm, and the servos whirred softly in the quiet arena. But broken doesn't mean useless. Sometimes it means you have to learn a better way. Krixva stared at the human's scars and artificial limbs with wide compound eyes. He had never seen injuries like these up close before. The metal arm looked strong but different from natural flesh. Lines of old wounds crossed Jake's chest and shoulder like a map of pain. The young Zalarian's fear began to mix with curiosity. Jake rolled his shoulder, making the cybernetic joint click softly. The blue lights along the arm pulsed as he moved it through different positions. He could see other athletes gathering around to watch, their own practice forgotten as they tried to understand what was happening. "This arm got blown off during the Battle of Kepler Station," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet arena. "Thought my fighting days were over. Doctors said I would never be combat ready again." He flexed the artificial fingers, and small motors hummed. "They were right about one thing. I could never fight the same way again." Krixva clicked softly in his native language, a sound that Jake's translator identified as a question. The boy was asking how Jake had learned to use the artificial arm. "Same way you're going to learn to fly with that wing," Jake replied, "by stopping trying to be what you used to be and figuring out what you can become instead." The human veteran moved closer but slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. He gestured toward Krixva's damaged wing with his natural hand. "May I look at it?" Jake asked. "I won't touch without permission." After a moment's hesitation, Krixva extended his injured wing. The damage was clearly old, probably from childhood. The wing membrane had healed badly, creating thick scar tissue that made the wing smaller and stiffer than it should be. But Jake's experienced eye caught something that the Zalarian coaches had missed. "This wing is actually stronger than your good one," Jake said, running his finger along the scarred edge without actually touching it. "See how thick the membrane is here? All that scar tissue makes it tougher. You've been trying to use it like it's weak, but it's not weak. It's different." Lisa Morrison arrived at her father's side, slightly out of breath from running across the arena floor. She carried her medical bag and looked worried about what Jake was planning to do. But when she saw the intense concentration on both her father's face and the young aliens, she stayed quiet and let them work. "In the military, we had a saying, Jake continued. Don't fight the enemy's fight. Fight your own fight. He demonstrated by moving his artificial arm in a sharp, precise motion that was completely different from natural human movement. This arm doesn't move like flesh and blood. If I try to make it work like a real arm, it fails. But if I use it the way it's designed to work, it can do things that flesh and blood can't do. Jake began showing HFY basic movements, but not the flowing, graceful motions that other Zalarians used. Instead, he demonstrated sharp, angular movements that worked with mechanical limitations rather than against them. Your damaged wing can't bend smoothly, so don't try to make it bend smoothly, Jake explained. Make it work like armor instead. Use the stiff parts to cut through air resistance. Use the thick spots to make sharp turns. He had HFY practice, moving his wing in small, controlled motions. Instead of trying to flap both wings together like other Zalarians, Jake taught him to use them independently. The damaged wing became a rudder and a brake, while the healthy wing provided most of the lift and thrust. Combat flying is different from sport flying, Jake said as he watched HFY experiment with the new technique. In combat, you don't need to look pretty. You need to be unpredictable. You need to survive. Other competitors had stopped their own practice sessions to watch this unusual lesson. Athletes from different species gathered around, fascinated by Jake's approach. Even some of the coaches had come over to observe, though they kept their distance and whispered among themselves. The Krathari team captain, whose silver mask reflected the arena lights, asked a question through his translator device. He wanted to know why Jake was teaching combat techniques to a sports competitor. Because sports and combat use the same principles, Jake replied without taking his eyes off HFY. Balance, timing, using your strengths against the opponent's weaknesses. The only difference is that in sports, you're not trying to kill anyone. Jake had HFY practice launching into short flights using the new technique. Instead of the graceful takeoffs that other Zalarians used, HFY learned to spring into the air with sharp, sudden movements. His damaged wing cut through the air like a blade, while his healthy wing provided controlled thrust. The first few attempts were clumsy, but Jake could see improvement with each try. HFY was a fast learner, and more importantly, he was starting to understand that his injury could be an advantage rather than a disability. Now try turning, Jake instructed. Don't flow into it like the others do. Snap into it. Use that stiff wing like a pivot point. HFY launched himself into the air again, this time attempting one of Jake's combat turns. Instead of the wide, sweeping curve that normal Zalarian flying used, he made a sharp, angular turn that changed his direction almost instantly. The movement looked strange compared to traditional flying, but it was fast and effective. Good, Jake said with satisfaction. Now you're flying like you, not like them. Lisa watched her father work with growing amazement. She had seen him train soldiers before, but never like this. He was adapting human military techniques for an alien physiology, creating something entirely new in the process. His understanding of how to turn weakness into strength was being applied in ways she had never imagined. The arena's attention was now completely focused on the human and Zalarian working together in one corner of the field. The scheduled events had paused as athletes, coaches, and spectators watched this unprecedented training session. Camera drones hovered overhead, broadcasting the scene to viewers across the galaxy. Jake taught HFY how to use his angular flying style in combat maneuvers. The damaged wing became a weapon itself, capable of making sudden directional changes that would be impossible for normally flying Zalarians. What had been a liability in traditional flying became a huge advantage in the combat-style approach that Jake was teaching. The key to fighting with disabilities, Jake explained as they took a break, is to make the enemy fight your kind of fight, not theirs. If they expect smooth and graceful, you give them sharp and unpredictable. If they plan for one kind of movement, you use a completely different kind. An Etherian athlete floated over to them, her blue skin shimmering with curiosity. She asked, through her translator, if Jake's techniques could work for other types of injuries or limitations. Any limitation can become an advantage if you're creative enough, Jake replied. The trick is to stop seeing it as something that's wrong with you and start seeing it as something that makes you different from everyone else. He demonstrated, with his own artificial arm, showing how its mechanical precision could be used for tasks that would be impossible with flesh and blood. The servo motors allowed for movements that human muscles could never achieve. The metal construction meant it never got tired or shaky. I spent 2 years trying to make this arm work like my old one, Jake said, flexing the cybernetic fingers. It was the worst 2 years of my life. Then I spent 6 months learning what this arm could do that my old one couldn't. Those were the best 6 months of my military career. HFY practiced more complex maneuvers, growing more confident with each attempt. His flying still looked nothing like traditional Zalarian grace, but it was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming effective in ways that traditional flying was not. Jake smiled as he watched the young alien master techniques that no other Zalarian had ever learned. The boy was not just adapting to his limitations anymore. He was turning them into weapons. The main competition events resumed after an hour break. Officials had extended the practice time because of the unusual training session happening between Jake and HFY. Word had spread throughout the arena that something special was taking place, and the stands were more crowded than ever. Even athletes who had already finished their events stayed to watch what would happen next. HFY stood at the starting line for the aerial agility trials, but he looked completely different from the nervous, struggling competitor who had crashed earlier. His posture was confident, and his damaged wing was held in a new position that looked ready for action, rather than trying to hide the injury. Jake stood behind the safety barrier with Lisa, watching with the focused attention of a military commander observing a crucial mission. The other Zalarian competitors lined up beside HFY, but they kept glancing at him with confusion and uncertainty. His flying style during practice had been so different from anything they had ever seen that they did not know what to expect. Some looked worried that his strange techniques might somehow interfere with their own performances. The course had been reset for the official competition. New obstacles had been added, making it more complex and challenging than the practice version. Floating barriers moved in unpredictable patterns, and the glowing rings had been made smaller and positioned at more difficult angles. This was the event that would determine which flyers would advance to the final rounds. The first competitor, a graceful female Zalarian named Vex Ra, took her position. She was considered the favorite to win the entire competition, known throughout the galaxy for her perfect technique and record-breaking speeds. When the starting signal sounded, she launched into the air with the flowing beauty that made Zalarian flying famous. Vex Ra moved through the course like liquid light, her wings catching and reflecting the arena illumination as she navigated around obstacles with effortless skill. She completed the course in a time that broke her own previous record, landing to thunderous applause from the crowd. The other Zalarian competitors looked nervous as they realized they would have to match or beat that incredible performance. The second and third flyers did well, but neither could match Vex Ra's time. Each one flew with the traditional Zalarian style, beautiful and graceful but ultimately predictable. The moving obstacles seemed designed to challenge exactly that kind of flying, requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination. Then it was HFY's turn. The young alien stepped up to the starting line, and the arena grew quiet with anticipation. Many spectators had heard about the training session with the human veteran, but nobody knew what to expect from the disabled competitor who had crashed so badly during practice. HFY spread his wings, the damaged one held at the sharp angle that Jake had taught him. Instead of the smooth, flowing preparation that other Zalarians used, he crouched low like a predator ready to strike. When the starting signal sounded, he exploded into the air with sudden, violent speed that caught everyone by surprise. His flying looked nothing like traditional Zalarian grace. Where the others flowed around obstacles, HFY cut through the air with sharp, angular movements that seemed almost aggressive. His damaged wing worked like a rudder, allowing him to make instant direction changes that would have been impossible with normal technique. The first obstacle was a series of rotating barriers that had given the previous competitors trouble. Vex Ra had navigated them with careful timing, waiting for the right moment to slip through the gaps. But HFY did not wait. He used his combat flying to punch through spaces that seemed too small, his stiff wing cutting through the air resistance, while his healthy wing provided precise thrust. The crowd began to murmur with excitement as they realized they were watching something completely new. Krixva's flying was not beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was effective in ways that normal flying could not match. He moved through the course like a fighter rather than a dancer, turning each obstacle into something to be conquered, rather than avoided. At the halfway point, Krixva was actually ahead of Vexra's record pace. The timing displays showed him completing sections faster than anyone had thought possible. But it was not just about speed. His unique style allowed him to take paths through the obstacles that other flyers could not use. The most challenging obstacle was near the end of the course. A series of moving platforms created a constantly changing maze that required perfect timing and prediction. Previous competitors had to slow down and carefully plan their route through the shifting barriers. Krixva did not slow down at all. Instead, he used his combat training to react instantly to each change in the obstacle pattern. His angular flying style meant he could change direction fast enough to adapt to the moving platforms in real time, rather than trying to predict where they would be. Jake watched from the sidelines with growing pride. The techniques he had taught were working even better than he had hoped. Krixva was not just competing anymore. He was dominating in a way that no one had expected. The young Zilarian shot through the final ring and crossed the finish line to stunned silence from the crowd. The timing display showed a number that seemed impossible. He had not just beaten Vexra's record, he had shattered it by a margin that redefined what anyone thought was possible in Zilarian flying. For a moment, the arena was completely quiet. Then the cheering began, starting with the human section where Jake stood and spreading throughout the entire stadium. Spectators from dozens of different species were on their feet, applauding a performance that had changed their understanding of what athletic competition could be. Krixva landed in the center of the field, his compound eyes bright with amazement at what he had just accomplished. The other Zilarian competitors surrounded him, clicking excitedly in their native language. Even Vexra, who had just lost her record, seemed more interested in understanding his technique than upset about her defeat. But the real transformation was just beginning. The next event was combat flight trials, where competitors had to navigate courses while avoiding simulated attacks. This was where Jake's military training really paid off. Krixva's angular, unpredictable flying style made him almost impossible to target with the automated defense systems. Where other competitors flew in patterns that the targeting computers could predict and track, Krixva moved like a real combat pilot trying to survive enemy fire. His damaged wing became an asset that allowed him to make evasive maneuvers that no healthy flyer could duplicate. He won the combat trials by an even larger margin than the agility event. By the time the flying competitions were finished, Krixva had not just qualified for the finals. He had won 2 events outright and placed second in a third. The arena was buzzing with excitement and confusion. Coaches from different species were studying video recordings of Krixva's flights, trying to understand the techniques he was using. Athletes were asking their own trainers why nobody had ever taught them to fly like that. Jake found himself surrounded by reporters and officials who wanted to understand what had happened. The quiet veteran who had just wanted to help one struggling competitor had accidentally started a revolution in galactic athletics. Lisa stood beside her father, tears of pride streaming down her face. She had watched him train soldiers before, but never in front of an audience of millions across the galaxy. The man who usually avoided attention and preferred to work alone had just become the most famous human in the sporting world. "How did you know it would work?" she asked him quietly while reporters clamored for interviews. Jake watched Krixva being congratulated by athletes from other species, all of them wanting to learn from the competitor they had dismissed just hours earlier. "I didn't know it would work," he admitted. "I just knew that giving up was not an option. Sometimes that's all you need to know." 3 days later, the closing ceremony of the Galactic Athletic Championships filled New Olympia's main arena with celebration and wonder. Athletes from all 12 species gathered on the field, wearing their medals and carrying the flags of their home worlds. The crowd cheered for heroes who had broken records and shown incredible skill during the competition. But everyone's attention kept returning to one particular figure. Krixva stood in the center of the winner's platform, holding 2 gold medals and 1 silver. His damaged wing, which had seemed like such a terrible limitation just days before, now looked like a badge of honor. Young athletes from other species kept approaching him, asking questions about his flying techniques through their translators. The ceremony officials had prepared a standard speech about athletic excellence and galactic cooperation. But when it came time for the winners to speak, HFY did something unexpected. He clicked rapidly in his native language, then switched to Galactic Standard so everyone could understand. "I want to share this platform with someone," the young Zalarian announced, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "These medals belong to both student and teacher." HFY gestured toward the section where Jake Morrison sat with his daughter. The cameras immediately focused on the scarred human veteran, who looked uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Jake shook his head and waved his artificial hand, trying to indicate that he should stay where he was, but HFY was not accepting that answer. He flew down from the platform and landed directly in front of Jake's seat. The entire arena watched, as the young champion spoke quietly to the human who had changed his life. After a brief conversation, Jake reluctantly allowed himself to be led onto the field. The sight of the human veteran and alien champion walking together toward the winner's platform became one of the most famous images in galactic sports history. Jake's military bearing and visible scars contrasted sharply with HFY's youthful energy and gleaming medals, but somehow they looked like they belonged together. When they reached the platform, HFY insisted that Jake stand beside him. The crowd's cheering grew louder as they realized they were witnessing something that had never happened before in galactic athletics. A non-competitor was sharing the victory ceremony, not because of politics or ceremony, but because an athlete believed his teacher deserved equal recognition. "This human taught me that strength comes not from having perfect parts, but from using what you have in perfect ways," HFY announced to the crowd. "He showed me that being different is not the same as being less. Without his wisdom, I would still be crashing into safety nets instead of standing here with these medals." Jake stood quietly beside the young champion, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else. But when reporters pushed microphones toward him, asking for comments about his teaching methods, he found himself speaking to a galactic audience whether he wanted to or not. "I didn't teach him anything special," Jake said in his rough accent. "I just showed him how to use what he already had. Every soldier learns that you fight with the equipment you have, not the equipment you wish you had. HFY had good equipment. He just needed to learn how to use it properly." The questions from reporters continued for over an hour after the official ceremony ended. Athletes from other species wanted to know if Jake's techniques could work, for their own limitations and injuries. Coaches asked about training methods that turned weaknesses into strengths. Officials inquired about incorporating combat-style training into traditional sports programs. Jake answered as many questions as he could, but it was clear that he was overwhelmed by the attention. Lisa stayed close to her father, helping him navigate the crowd of reporters and officials who wanted to speak with him. She could see that he was getting tired and stressed by all the focus on him. But the real impact of what had happened was only beginning to show itself. Within weeks of the championship, athletic programs across the galaxy were requesting information about Jake's training methods. The Morrison technique, as it came to be called, was being studied and adapted for use with athletes from dozens of different species. The basic principles that Jake had demonstrated were surprisingly universal. The idea of turning limitations into advantages, of fighting your own fight instead of the enemy's fight, applied to much more than just damaged wings or artificial limbs. Athletes who were too small for their sport learned to use speed and agility. Those who were too slow learned to use strength and endurance. Competitors who lacked traditional advantages found new ways to excel. Medical rehabilitation centers began adopting Jake's approaches for helping injured people return to active lives. Instead of trying to restore patients to exactly what they had been before their injuries, therapists started teaching them to become something new and potentially better. But perhaps the most important change was in how different species viewed each other and themselves. Jake's intervention had shown that limitations and differences were not things to be hidden or overcome, but resources to be developed and celebrated. The image of the scarred human veteran teaching the disabled alien athlete became a symbol of cooperation and understanding that spread far beyond the sports world. 6 months after the championship, Jake received an official invitation to establish a training academy on New Olympia. The Galactic Sports Federation wanted him to create a permanent program for athletes who did not fit traditional training methods. The academy would serve competitors from all species who had injuries, disabilities, or physical characteristics that made conventional coaching ineffective. Jake initially refused the offer. He was not comfortable with fame and preferred the quiet life he had built for himself after leaving the military. But Lisa convinced him to at least visit the proposed facility and meet with some of the athletes who wanted to train with him. The visit changed his mind. Young competitors from across the galaxy had come to New Olympia, hoping to learn from the human who had revolutionized athletic training. Many of them had stories similar to Crix Vaz. They were talented athletes whose careers had been limited by injuries or genetic differences that made traditional training impossible. Jake saw himself in their eyes, the same determination he had felt when his own military career seemed over after losing his arm. These young people needed someone who understood that being different was not the same as being defeated. The Morrison Training Academy opened 1 year after the championship that had changed everything. Jake served as head instructor, teaching courses in adaptive athletics and combat-style training. Crix Va became his assistant, helping to demonstrate techniques and work with new students who were still learning to see their limitations as assets. The Academy's motto, suggested by Jake himself, was simple: fight your own fight. It was painted in dozens of languages above the entrance, reminding every student who walked through the doors that their unique challenges were actually their greatest advantages. Years later, when sports historians looked back at the Galactic Athletic Championships that had changed everything, they would note that the most important victory had not been won on the competition field. It had been won in a quiet moment, when one scarred veteran decided to help one struggling young athlete, proving that the greatest strength in the galaxy was the willingness to help others discover what they were truly capable of achieving. Jake Morrison never became completely comfortable with his fame, but he found peace in knowing that his experience and knowledge were helping young athletes across the galaxy transform their limitations into victories. And whenever anyone asked him about his greatest accomplishment, he would always point to the medals and trophies won by his students, proud that he had helped them discover their own unique ways to fly.